This is Something to Gnaw On, and I'm your host, Nate Vinio. And this is Season 3, where I'm reading through a book called Insights of Pastoral Significance by none other than my dad, Pastor Ed Vinio. If you'd like to get this book in print, I'll have a link in the show notes for you. Also, this season will include chapter options, which will allow you to quickly revisit portions of the episode if you so desire in a more efficient manner. In this episode, we will cover the last two factors or imperatives in Peter's paradigm. That would be the empire strikes and sheep behaving badly. Here we go. The empire strikes. Official Roman hostility had previously been spotty. It manifested itself in active persecution only sporadically and in limited areas, now in the capital, now in this province, now in that one. Attempting to calm the demand for empire-wide persecution of Christians, Emperor Trajan had stated Christians were not to be hunted down. However, pressure was mounting on Rome to act on a larger scale. First, Christianity was beginning to be seen as a religion of its own rather than the benign, obscure Jewish sect as Rome had viewed it. Because Christians sought to make converts of everyone in the empire, they were perceived as a political threat by Nero. Second, peace in the empire was being disturbed by constant uproar against the church from pagans and Jews. Rome could not tolerate civil instability and responded to incidents with crushing power. It was this concern which saved Paul's life when Demetrius, the silversmith, whipped up the Ephesians against Paul and his teaching. The city clerk realized the danger for Ephesus and spoke to the crowd, quote, "So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in a lawful assembly. For indeed, we are in danger of being accused of a riot in connection with today's events. Since then there is no real cause for it, and in this connection we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering." Acts 19:38-40. Third, events such as described by Luke in Acts 19 were having negative economic impact on the empire. Tax money which had flowed from pagan temples to Rome was drying up due to the dwindling attendance as multitudes were converted to Christ. Fourth, when Rome was nearly destroyed by a fire, allegedly started by Emperor Nero, he found Christians to be a convenient scapegoat. As a result, emotions boiled over, and large numbers of disciples were horribly tortured and killed. Soon, what had been remote fires became an empire-wide conflagration. Factor number 8, sheep behaving badly. Context discloses another source of suffering, one the churches could do something about. At issue were sheep whose suffering was caused by their poor behavior within the fellowship and their pagan communities. Peter found it expedient to remind them of the following, quote, "Have sincere love for your brothers. Love one another deeply from the heart. Therefore rid yourself of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind." 1 Peter 1, verses 22 through chapter 2, verse 1. Also, quote, "Finally, all of you, live in harmony with one another. Be sympathetic. Love as brothers. Be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but with blessing. Because of this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing." 1 Peter 3, 8 and 9. Quote, "For it is better, if God should will it so, that you should suffer for doing what is right, rather than doing what is wrong." 1 Peter 3:17. Quote, "Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer, or thief, or evildoer, or a troublesome meddler. 1 Peter 4:15. Peter was aware of the conflicts and underlying tensions existing within the churches of Asia Minor and addressed them head-on in this epistle. While they had temptations common to humankind, their unique background added a volatile mix that occasionally revived in their treatment of one another. Old factions, once covered by brotherly love, can reconstitute quickly in conflict. These differences are not unlike the mixture within local churches today. Various cultural, philosophical, and doctrinal traditions may exist in the same assembly. In an article addressing the top 5 reasons for pastoral terminations, Bob Sheffield says, quote, "A pastor who is unaware of this underlying and unresolved conflict may be unknowingly caught in the middle." End quote. Wisdom can be gained from Nehemiah's approach to a sticky and troublesome leadership assignment. He was to revive a completely demoralized people to do the impossible, rebuild the walls of Jerusalem against all odds. What did he do on his first day in town? He took a midnight tour of the city himself, objectively assessing the difficulties. Then, with full awareness of the negatives, he proceeded, armed with prevailing wisdom and an absolute confidence in God's promise. A double miracle resulted. 1. The people entrenched in despair and defeatism rose up in faith. And 2. God prospered their work until even their enemies had to confess God had performed a wonder. Nehemiah 1-6. Jesus advised this same approach to any project. Quote, "For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" Luke 14:28-30. Likewise, it is not unwise for the pastoral candidate to assess the health of the church so that he might be prepared to face issues wisely. He dare not ignore their existence, because he will not be able later to simply declare the conflict over. Sheffield adds these observations. Fact number 1. These conflicts do not end when a pastor, leader, or group declares that the conflict is over. Fact number 2. Church conflicts, which have resulted in strong emotional differences of opinion, are not resolved in a majority church vote. Quote, "In a majority vote situation, the majority voters may leave the meeting declaring, 'We've won.' The minority voters may leave with a feeling of, 'We lost, but we'll get them next time.' The next time may be a month or a year or longer. As a result of this type of win-lose vote, I've observed church families with long-standing distrust and built-up resentment. When this happens, every vote, no matter how insignificant, becomes a win-lose vote." End quote. Additionally, personality differences drive sinful responses between church members and pastors. Peacemaker Ministries' senior ministry consultant Dave Eddings has intervened in many church conflicts and says, quote, "People are different. Some of those differences lead to conflict that all too often frequently results in power plays and manipulation on the personal level. People pick favorites, and when a favorite is attacked, conflict erupts on a much larger scale. Worldly responses to conflict, rather than biblical ones, seem to be particularly prevalent when simple personality conflicts are encountered, and people easily forget that these situations provide a great opportunity for biblical peacemaking." End quote. Those who pastor must be free from divisive passions, showing love and non-partiality towards all their sheep, yet always speaking the truth, always leading in paths of righteousness. It is easy for a pastor to blame his congregation or board for their rebelliousness, not realizing that his own poor conduct, attitudes, and leadership may have brought out the worst in them. Pastors are called to be peacemakers within the flock, as well as protectors from wolves on the outside. Potential for external and/or internal combustion calls for pastors able to handle the heat without becoming heated themselves. If you're wondering if this is really a significant problem in today's churches, consider these facts presented by Ken Sande, president of Peacemaker Ministries. Born-again Christians in the U.S. file 4 to 8 million lawsuits every year, often against other Christians, costing $20 to $40 billion. There are approximately 19,000 major church conflicts in the U.S. each year, an average of 50 per day. 1,500 pastors leave their assignments every month in the U.S. because of conflict, burnout, or moral failure, costing the church at least $684 million each year. 25% of the churches in one survey reported conflict in the previous 5 years that was serious enough to have a lasting impact on congregational life. 23% of all current pastors in the United States have been fired or forced to leave. 45% of the pastors who were fired in one denomination left the ministry altogether. The 7 primary reasons for forced exit all involve some form of conflict. In a Fuller Institute of Church Growth survey, it was discovered that 90% of pastors felt they were not adequately trained to cope with the ministry demands placed upon them, and 40% reported serious conflict with a parishioner at least once a month. John LaRue's research for Christianity Today International found 31% of pastors wished seminaries and Bible schools would offer training in conflict management. Says Ken Sande, quote, "Unless seminaries fill this gap, they will continue to send out pastors who may have mastered Greek and Hebrew, but are unprepared to deal with the conflicts that are likely to destroy their pastoral careers and their churches." End quote. What potential for division was embedded in the believer's Jewish background? Consider the following. Cultural factions. Quote, "In the Jewish world as a whole, there was some tension between Hebrews and Hellenists, and this tension survived between members of the two groups who had acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah and been incorporated into the Messianic community. Evidence of this is seen in the dispute between Hellenistic and Hebrew Christians in the early days of the Jerusalem church. One of the bright spots of the first Christian fellowship was their care for one another's needs, especially those of widows. But insidious partisanship spoiled the sweet fruit of mutual love." Quote, "Now at this time the disciples were increasing in number. A complaint arose on the part of the Hellenistic Jews against the native Hebrews, because their widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food." End quote. Acts 6, verse 1. Division between Hebrews and Hellenists was primarily linguistic and cultural. Hebrews were Jews who were native to Palestine and who spoke the language of their forefathers. Because they lived closer to the temple, they were more involved in its activities than the Hellenists. As a matter of spiritual purity, they remained distinct from the Gentile world and from Jews they felt were contaminated by it, i.e., the Hellenist. Hellenists were Jews living in Gentile communities. They spoke Greek and used the Greek version of the Old Testament. Unlike Hebrews, they were open to new ideas and mixed more easily with Gentiles. Such open-mindedness presented both pluses and minuses. For example, it increased their susceptibility to false teachers, probably a reason Peter called for the diligent oversight by elders in chapter 5, verse 3. On the other hand, the gospel found a more receptive audience with them than among the Hebrews. Quote, "Hellenists maintained a more liberal outlook than the Hebrews, including the apostles." End quote. For example, in Acts 10, we see the apostle Peter protesting God's command to visit Cornelius, a Gentile. In contrast, Hellenists fleeing Saul's persecution in Jerusalem, quote, "carried the gospel with them to neighboring regions and provinces where they sought refuge, so that before long it took root in non-Jewish soil." End quote. Because they moved so easily among the Gentiles, they were more effective missionaries than their Hebrew counterparts. Hellenists were a major part of the first church, not only numerically, but also in key roles. The first organizational change was the addition of deacons, Acts 6, verses 1 through 7. The first 7 of whom were most likely Hellenists, judging by their names. Stephen, a Hellenist, began preaching in Jerusalem's synagogues, touching off a riot that led to his death, and it was the Hellenist disciples then who were forced to flee Jerusalem, and not the Hebrew apostles. Does not the pastor today also find similar currents of legalism and liberty within the church? Do some of the same biases reside in his heart? To understand these backgrounds and navigate in a way to promote love, understanding, and grace without compromise is a modern-day challenge, as well as an ancient one. It must be done. Reemerging theological prejudices. Between 7 and 12 philosophical divisions among the Jews are usually identified with the era in which Peter wrote. Hippolytus, an early church writer, 170 to 236 AD, focused on the primary ones when he said, quote, "There are 3 divisions among them, the Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes." End quote. Their relationships were often contentious, and conversion to Christ didn't always resolve their attitudes towards one another. The result? Church conflict. Paul well understood these dynamics within Judaism and took advantage of them on at least one occasion. Acts 23, 6 through 10. On trial before the court of Sadducees and Pharisees, Paul was able to turn his accusers on one another by simply mentioning the doctrine of the resurrection. Sadducees considered it heresy, while Pharisees earnestly held to it. Luke describes the ensuing scene as stasis, i.e., an uprising or an insurrection, resulting in schizo, or division, or split, and a megas kragi, a great outcry. Paul was in danger of being literally torn apart in the fierce fighting. Other examples of contentiousness between Jewish sects abound. Saul of Tarsus, a Pharisee, not only zealously persecuted Christians, but Essenes as well. Essenes separated themselves from Pharisees and Sadducees because they considered them too liberal. Sadducees reverenced the temple and its priesthood, but Essenes felt the temple and priesthood were contaminated by an illegitimate priesthood and would not participate. For example, Justin in the 2nd century knew of Jews in the diaspora who believed that God had rejected the temple sacrifices in favor of the prayers of his people living among the Gentiles. Each sect held different views regarding free will. Essenes believed human will was helpless against the will of God. Sadducees stressed unlimited freedom of the will, and Pharisees held firm to conditional freedom of will. Pharisaical and Essene beliefs in resurrection, demons, and angels were seen as occultist by the Sadducees. Tensions also developed because Sadducees resisted Pharisaical additions to the law, which helplessly encumbered people. It's not hard to appreciate the difficulty level of Peter's admonishment to Jewish believers. Quote, "Let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit." Chapter 3, verse 8. Pharisees. Pharisees basically controlled the synagogues in the diaspora as well as Palestine, and eventually succeeded in expelling Christians from them. They were the popular party because they were considered true Jews, and because they were drawn from the tradesmen of Jewish towns. Due to their aversion to anything impure, they were called the separate ones, but their purity was strictly external. To their credit, they held the Old Testament as authoritative and valued study of the Scriptures. However, obedience to the law was considered the only means to eternal life. Those who converted to Christianity tended to be harsh and legalistic. Many became Judaizers, a name given to militant Jewish Christians who insisted Jewish and Gentile converts keep the law, including circumcision and prohibitions of unclean meat, Acts 15. Their divisiveness in the church posed a serious threat and drew many apostolic rebukes. Sadducees. Sadducees, on the other hand, were wealthy men with lax morals. Josephus gives this estimation of Ananias the high priest, 47 through 59 A.D., quote, "He was a typical Sadducee, wealthy, haughty, unscrupulous, filling his sacred office for purely selfish and political ends, anti-nationalist in relation to the Jews, friendly to the Romans." End quote. Most of the priests were Sadducees. Though small in number, they dominated the political life of the Jews. Sadducees emphasized the importance of temple worship and the priestly functions, but denied key doctrines such as the resurrection. F. Bruce makes this observation, quote, "A Pharisee might become a Christian without ceasing to be a Pharisee. A Sadducee could not become a Christian and remain a Sadducee." End quote. The challenge for pastors was to prevent their former unscrupulous politics, elitism, selfishness, and moral laxity from rematerializing in the church. The bond of brotherly love so enjoyed by the early church was a fragile thing, easily shattered by contention. Essenes. Though the New Testament does not mention Essenes, there were some striking similarities to Christianity, i.e., sharing with one another, Acts 4:34 through 35, or love feasts. There were, however, great contrasts to Christianity, i.e., asceticism, isolationism, and legalism. And while early attacks on Christian liberty had come from Judaizers of Pharisaical background, the far more legalistic Essenes eventually dominated the movement within the church. Late research on the Dead Sea Scrolls identifies a particular Essene teaching as one combated by Paul in Galatia. It concerned a phrase unique to Paul's epistles and the scrolls, Mahasa HaTorah, which was equivalent to what we know in English from Paul's letters as, quote, "works of the law," end quote. Their teaching strove to enslave Christians, Jews and Gentiles both, to the law, something that drew the strongest rebukes from Paul. "You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" Galatians 3:1. Quote, "For as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse," end quote. Galatians 3:10. Quote, "I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another gospel. Only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we, or an angel from heaven, should preach to you a gospel contrary to that which we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say it again now. If any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed." Galatians 1:6 through 9. These internal dynamics need the oversight of a pastor who would encourage loving relationships between believers from all backgrounds. For example, Peter said, quote, "Since you have, in obedience to the truth, purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, fervently love one another from the heart." 1 Peter 1, verse 22. Also, quote, "Above all, keep fervent in your love for one another, because love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without complaint." 1 Peter 4, verse 8 and 9. And guys, we will conclude this episode right here. I trust that there's plenty of food for thought here, plenty for you to gnaw on, if you will. Next week, we will kick off Chapter 3, the details of the paradigm. Until then, God bless.